What if the Queen's final message to the royal family wasn't spoken at all, but quietly written into a will? Think about that for a second. Not a speech, not a warning, not a press release. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Just a decision, a signature, and a name nobody expected. Because when whispers began circulating that Lady Louise Windsor was set to inherit one of Queen Elizabeth's most private estates, jaws dropped across Britain. And across the Atlantic, the reaction was reportedly far louder. Here's the uncomfortable question no one wants to ask out loud. Why her? Why not the spare who walked away? Why not the Duchess who said she was mistreated? Why not the couple who insists they were cut off, pushed out, and silenced? Why not Harry and Meghan? That question alone has ignited a fresh storm, one that cuts deeper than money, deeper than property, and straight into the emotional fault lines of the modern royal family. Because this wasn't crown estate business, this wasn't automatic inheritance, this wasn't ceremonial. This was personal. For 70 years, Queen Elizabeth II was many things: sovereign, symbol, constant. But behind closed doors, she was also a grandmother who watched, who noticed, who remembered, who showed up quietly, and who made noise when things didn't go their way. And Lady Louise? She was never the headline, never the controversy, never the complaint. She didn't give interviews. She didn't leak feelings. She didn't demand explanations. She stayed invisible, almost deliberately so. And now, suddenly, she's at the center of a story that threatens to reopen everything Prince Harry and Meghan Markle say they escaped. Because to Prince Harry, inheritance isn't just about assets. It's about acknowledgement, about still mattering, about proof that walking away didn't mean being erased. And to Meghan Markle, symbolism matters, recognition matters, validation matters. So when a quiet niece, raised without drama, shielded from cameras, and praised for discretion, appears to receive something deeply private from the Queen, the message feels unmistakable. This wasn't about rank. This wasn't about gender. This wasn't even about tradition. It was about trust. And that's where the sting begins. Because how do you reconcile claims of exclusion with a decision that suggests the Queen was making careful, intentional choices until the very end? How do you argue you were pushed out when the monarch appears to have quietly closed the door herself? Ask yourself this: if the Queen believed Harry and Meghan had been wronged, truly wronged, would she have bypassed them like this? Or is this inheritance the clearest sign yet that the late monarch saw the family divide very differently than the couple who keep talking about it? And here's the part that changes everything. This estate wasn't just land. It wasn't just walls and gates and money. It was believed to be a refuge, a place of peace, a place the Queen associated with loyalty and silence. So when she chose Lady Louise, she may have been saying something far more powerful than words ever could. But once news of that choice reached California, the emotional aftershocks were only just beginning. Lady Louise never asked for anything, and in a family where expectation often screams louder than duty, that silence may have spoken volumes. From the very beginning, Lady Louise Windsor occupied a strange position inside the royal hierarchy. She wasn't an heir. She wasn't a spare, she wasn't groomed for the spotlight, and she certainly wasn't prepared for controversy. In fact, most people barely noticed her at all. And that was exactly the point. While other royals learned how to manage cameras, headlines, and public narratives, Louise grew up largely shielded. Her parents made deliberate choices. Fewer public appearances, fewer expectations, less noise. She attended school like a normal teenager. She competed in carriage driving quietly, a hobby deeply associated with her grandfather. She showed up, smiled politely, and went home. No interviews, no complaints. No truth-telling specials, just presence. And if there was one thing Queen Elizabeth II valued above almost everything else, it was that. Showing up without demanding applause, carrying the weight without broadcasting the burden. Think about how rare that became in the final years of her life. As the monarchy faced unprecedented pressure, from media scrutiny to internal fractures, the Queen watched her family fracture along very public lines. Some chose to stay and endure. Others chose to leave and explain, repeatedly. Lady Louise did neither. She stayed, quietly. And that contrast matters more than people realize. Because inheritance decisions like this aren't made on a whim. They're shaped by decades of observation, of dinners attended, of conversations overheard, of who asks for reassurance and who simply offers loyalty without conditions. Louise never positioned herself as deserving. She never argued for relevance. She never tried to modernize the monarchy or monetize it. She didn't need to. That restraint, in royal terms, is currency. Now compare that to the emotional atmosphere surrounding Prince Harry in the years before the Queen's death. Public grievances. Private resentments made public. Pain explained in great detail, again and again. And here's the contradiction that's hard to ignore. Harry says he wanted freedom. But freedom, by definition, comes with distance. And distance has consequences. So when people ask why Louise, the real answer might be simpler and more uncomfortable than anyone wants to admit. She represented continuity without chaos. And to a monarch whose entire life was defined by stability, that wasn't just admirable, it was essential. Ask yourself this: if you were nearing the end of your life and you had one final personal decision to make, who would you trust with something deeply private? Someone who had spent years criticizing the institution you embodied, or someone who had lived quietly within it, never demanding more than what was offered? The Queen didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to justify the choice. She let the choice speak. And that silence, it may be the loudest judgment of all, because as word of this inheritance spread, it became impossible to ignore the implication. That loyalty without noise was rewarded. That restraint mattered. That quiet service still counted for something. And somewhere far from palace walls, that realization was beginning to land. Hard, because once the shock faded, a far more painful question emerged, one that cut deeper than disappointment and straight into identity. If Lady Louise was chosen not by accident but by design, what does that say about everyone else who wasn't? And for Harry and Meghan, that question was only just beginning to burn. The question didn't come quietly. It arrived like a bruise you don't notice until you touch it. Why not us? That single thought, unspoken but heavy, hung in the air the moment the implications of the Queen's decision became impossible to ignore. Because for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, this wasn't just about an estate. It wasn't even about money. It was about what the choice symbolized. For years, Harry has framed his departure from royal life as an act of survival, a necessary escape from a system he claims damaged him, ignored his pain, and failed to protect his family. Meghan echoed that narrative, describing isolation, neglect, and a lack of support so severe it justified walking away entirely. But here's where the story takes an uncomfortable turn. You can't say you were forced out and still expect to be chosen. You can't claim independence and feel wounded when independence is taken seriously. And yet, that's exactly where the tension lies, because inheritance, especially private inheritance, isn't about obligation. It's about preference. It's about trust. It's about who you believe will protect something rather than turn it into a statement. And if Harry believed, even quietly, that the Queen would one day extend an olive branch through her will, this decision shattered that hope in the most definitive way possible. No interview rebuttal, no clarification, no context, just absence. Imagine how that lands emotionally. For Harry, whose identity has always been tied to his place within the family, being excluded doesn't just sting, it destabilizes. It suggests that the Queen didn't see him as misunderstood, but as someone who had already chosen a different path. And for Meghan, whose narrative centers on being wronged and sidelined, this feels like a verdict rendered without a defense. Because if the Queen truly believed Harry and Meghan had been treated unfairly, if she saw them as victims of an outdated system, wouldn't this have been the moment to say so? Wouldn't a private inheritance have been the safest, quietest way to acknowledge that? Instead, the opposite happened. The most private gift went to the most private royal, and that contrast is brutal. This is where irony creeps in, sharp and unavoidable. Harry and Meghan have spoken endlessly about reclaiming their voice, about telling their truth, about refusing to be silent. Lady Louise said nothing, and she was rewarded. Ask yourself this: is that favoritism or consequence? Because to the Queen, silence wasn't weakness. It was discipline. It was respect. It was the ability to hold something sacred without turning it into content. And that's the part that hurts the most, not being excluded from wealth, but being excluded from trust. Because once that realization settles in, the narrative changes. This isn't about what Harry and Meghan lost when they left. It's about what they may have forfeited by speaking too loudly, too often, for too long. And here's the chilling thought that lingers. If this was the Queen's final private message delivered without words, what other doors quietly closed along with it? Because the inheritance wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a reckoning. And what followed would make this decision feel less like a snub and more like a warning. By the time the dust settled, one thing became impossible to deny. This wasn't about land. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about inheritance in the traditional sense. It was about a message. And like so many of Queen Elizabeth's most consequential decisions, it was delivered without spectacle, without explanation, and without apology. Think back to the opening question. Why her? Why Lady Louise? The answer, unsettling as it may be, reveals something deeper about how the Queen saw the fracture in her family. Not as a tragedy imposed on Harry and Meghan, but as a choice they made, step by step, interview by interview, distance by distance. Because throughout her reign, the Queen believed in one principle above all others: duty before emotion. Not because emotion didn't matter, but because duty was what held everything together when emotion threatened to tear it apart. Lady Louise embodied that belief without ever announcing it. She didn't brand it. She didn't explain it. And that, more than lineage or rank, appears to have earned the Queen's trust. Now, circle back to Harry and Meghan's lingering frustration. The anger, the disbelief, the sense of injustice. Ask yourself this honestly. If the Queen had reversed course, if she had rewarded public descent with private inheritance, what precedent would that have set? What would it have said about loyalty? About silence? About the meaning of service? It would have contradicted everything she stood for. So instead, she did what she had always done best. She chose continuity over chaos, discretion over disclosure, trust over noise, and in doing so, she may have delivered the clearest answer Harry and Meghan never wanted to hear. You weren't punished, you were understood. Understood as people who no longer belonged to the private world she was trying to protect. That's the part no interview can soften. Because exclusion hurts more when it isn't dramatic, when it isn't angry, when it isn't loud, when it's calm, when it's final, and when it comes from someone who no longer has to explain herself. This inheritance didn't scream rejection. It whispered resolution. It said, "This chapter is closed." So where does that leave Harry and Meghan now? Still speaking, still explaining, still insisting their truth must be heard. But the monarchy they're responding to has already answered, without words, without cameras, without rebuttal. And Lady Louise, the royal who never asked why not me, became the living proof that sometimes the crown listens most closely to those who say nothing at all. That's the irony that lingers. The Queen didn't reward silence to punish speech. She rewarded it because silence protected what she loved. And in the end, that may be the most devastating truth of all. There's one final layer to the story that makes the Queen's decision feel less like family drama and more like a legacy move. Because when people talk about inheritance, they imagine wealth changing hands, titles, property, security. But what Queen Elizabeth passed on to Lady Louise was something far more dangerous. Meaning, for Harry and Meghan, the pain doesn't come from losing access to an estate. It comes from losing the argument. Because inheritance has a way of freezing narratives in place. Once it's done, it can't be reframed, clarified, or walked back. And this one landed like a full stop. For years, Harry and Meghan have told the world they were pushed out, marginalized, forced to choose between mental health and monarchy. It's a story built on exclusion. But this inheritance flips that logic on its head. It suggests the Queen wasn't cutting people off in anger. She was making calm, deliberate decisions about who belonged inside her most private world and who didn't. That distinction matters, because being excluded out of cruelty creates sympathy. Being excluded out of clarity creates discomfort, and that discomfort is what lingers now. Ask yourself this: if the Queen truly believed Harry and Meghan were victims of an unjust system, why would she entrust something personal to someone else? Why wouldn't she use her final act to heal, to compensate, to reassure? Unless she didn't see it that way. Unless she believed Harry wasn't abandoned, but had already left. This is where the emotional weight becomes unavoidable. Harry didn't just lose proximity to the crown when he stepped back. He may have lost access to the Queen's inner circle of trust. And once that circle closed, no amount of explanation could reopen it. That's the unspoken consequence no one prepared him for. You can leave a family physically, but emotionally, that's a different exit altogether. And Lady Louise's inheritance appears to mark the moment the Queen accepted that some relationships were no longer salvageable, not because of hatred, but because of incompatibility, silence versus exposure, privacy versus performance, continuity versus reinvention. The Queen chose what she knew, and in doing so, she left behind a message that doesn't flatter anyone who still needs to explain themselves. Because the most powerful part of the story is what didn't happen. No statement from the palace. No rebuttal to interviews, no correction of narratives, just a quiet choice that said more than words ever could. So when Harry and Meghan ask, "Why not us?" the answer may already be written, etched not in anger, but in resolve. You weren't forgotten. You were understood. And for a man who has spent years trying to be understood on his own terms, that realization may be harder to accept than any loss of title or property. Because this wasn't the monarchy rejecting Harry. It was the Queen accepting reality. And Lady Louise, by doing nothing at all, became the symbol of everything the Queen believed would endure after her. Now here's the final question, one that lingers long after the headlines fade.